Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to the organisers for the opportunity of presenting today and hearing views of other presenters as well. My presentation isn't going to have nearly as many pretty pictures as the previous one. And it's a rather broader presentation in nature, because what I'm trying to do is to get you to think a little about some of the words that you hear a lot about these days, smart cities being the particular phrase in question. And I want to get you to think about that by telling you my perception of where those ideas and concepts have come from, how they have been implemented to date, and where they might be going in the future. And along the way, I'll drop in a few little tidbits of information about the sort of research that we do, but mainly I'm trying to look at this field from a more general level. So one of the things that that universities are guilty of many things these days, and one of their greatest crimes is that they don't teach history properly. They take a rather particular view of history in many cases, but I think history teaches us a lot. And to start this journey, I want to look back in order to understand where we are and to look forward. And as the chair has indicated, I'm a transport person. So when I look at things, I look at them through the eyes of a transport person. So from that perspective, if we had been meeting in the early 1900s, and if we'd been looking out the window of this splendid building, which of course wouldn't have existed in the early 1900s, what we would have seen, amongst many other things, was a lot of horses, an awful lot of horses. Everything that moved in London that wasn't pulled by a human, that wasn't moved by a human, was moved by a horse. And that meant that there was a hell of a lot of horses in London. It's about 100,000 horses altogether, providing the hansom cab functionality, these wonderful things up here. But then there was about double that number doing more mundane things like pulling buses or pulling delivery vehicles. About 300,000 horses altogether in London per day. And one of the things that horses do when they pull things is that they excrete. And horse manure, a typical horse will produce something around 16 kilograms of manure a day. It depends upon the horse, of course. My Little Pony, a little bit less. Great Big Dray, a lot more. But around 16k manure each day. And if you do the sums, and I hope I've done the sums right, because I used to be a mathematician a long time ago, that amounts to somewhere over 1 million tons of horse manure per year. And that's a lot of manure. And this created a recurrent political, social, and technological phenomenon, a panic. There was a panic about what's going to become of the city as a result of all this manure. Politicians would try to outdo themselves in the degree of apocalyptic mayhem that they would use to describe this manure-infested and encrusted future that awaited London. The Times of London, then, sadly not now, but then a reliable source of information, committed this particular set of words to its pages. Now this is, I say this because it had an important consequence. This panic brought about a very important change. Within a generation, almost all those horses had gone. There were a few tens of thousands that remained in specialist niche applications, delivering coal, delivering beer. Beer was very popular to be delivered by horses. I'm old enough to remember when coal was still delivered by horses in the late 1950s, early 1960s. But horses were largely replaced by electric and diesel traction. Within a generation, those 300,000 horses had gone. Horse meat. And I think there are some important lessons here when we think about contemporary innovation processes in cities. The first, of course, which I haven't noted down there, but is an important one to note, is that there's nothing new about innovation in cities. Second point is that when the conditions are right, change can happen very quickly. And this isn't just a phenomenon of the digital age. The second or third point, I suppose, I want to mention is that the trajectory of that change can be very unpredictable, because the dominant mode of traction that replaced the horse was in fact electric. And again, some of the more mature individuals in the audience may remember trolley buses that existed in London to the early 1960s. What led to their replacement? Well, it was nationalisation of the power grid in the post-war period by the then Labour government. Because one of the consequences of that was that all the little local generation facilities that had enabled the individual bus companies to cheaply produce power, to power their trolley bus systems, they were all taken under state control, and it was made a great deal more expensive, as is often the case when that happens. So the path of innovation, once you launch on it, can be very, very unpredictable. And of course, governments now are struggling to reintroduce electric traction, electric mobility. But perhaps the most important lesson, the final one, is that really large-scale innovation requires an ensemble of driving factors. It requires political will, something that motivates the political class to get up and take notice. In the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, it was horse manure. We have our own versions of the panics. I'll come to those in a minute. But also, it needs more than one driver, because behind this transition was not just political panic, it was a very strong economic driver. Those 300,000 horses in the centre of London occupied a hell of a lot of space. That valuable land was preempted by those horses. Developers wanted those horses out to replace those horses with buildings and occupants that they could earn more money from. Also, the nascent motor industry, Mr. Ford and Mr. Benz and Mr. Daimler, they wanted to create a market for their products and services. So there is some suspicion that some of this panic that existed around the manure-sodden future of the city was a manufactured panic. Now, with all that in mind, let's turn to the current panics. And there's lots of current panics. You can all list them. I've listed a few here. I've taken these, by the way. These aren't particularly my panics. These are panics as articulated by Her Majesty's government in various sources. So climate change panic, water resources panics, poverty panics, healthcare panics, of course, waste panics, air pollution panics, congestion panics, crime panics. Does it ring a bell? And just as in the early parts of the last century, those panics led to creative solutions, and it led to the creation of environments in which new thinking can occur. So is the case now. In the early 2000s, the ICT industry began to realize that those panics in cities potentially created an opportunity for a new sort of business, a business that was about addressing the needs of cities, and I suppose, therefore, to some degree, the needs of citizens, to mitigate those problems. And they created a particular narrative about why those problems arise, how they might be solved, and of course, their own place in that solution, naturally. And the narrative said that those problems, those panics, were caused by, or at least significantly exacerbated by, cities being composed of lots of closely coupled interacting systems, subsystems, the transport system, the power system, the water system, the waste system, the healthcare system, the education system, the crime system, blah, 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 all of those, all deeply interpenetrated and interconnected with one another, but very poorly coordinated, very poorly mutually organized, with very limited or non-existent situational awareness, as the battlefield planners put it. That is, understanding of where they sit within the wider picture and what others are doing. And therefore very limited ability organizationally and institutionally to adapt to new challenges. So that was a particular diagnosis. There may well be some truth in that diagnosis, I don't doubt it. But it was a very particular diagnosis. And that particular diagnosis led to a particular prescription. And that particular prescription was that what's needed to address those panics is cities that are better integrated, where all those subsystems can work together harmoniously, can pull in the same direction, can be integrated. And it just so happens, of course, that creating technologies that enable subsystems to work together, to share information, to coordinate in some way, that's exactly what the ICT sector does. Just as creating things that replace horses is exactly what Mr. Ford and Mr. Daimler and Mr. Benz did. So that's the genesis of where we are now with the smart city idea. That's where it came from. That's what it amounts to. And you can see that there's also a sort of quasi-religious component to this, because we've got hell all down here. We have all these poorly connected, dysfunctional, mutually interdependent, but sometimes contradictory and hostile subsystems down here. And we have the savior in the middle. The savior is integration. And of course, the savior is the ICT sector, the academic sector that serves the ICT sector, and the political institutions, et cetera, that enjoy integrating things. And sitting in the heaven above all that, as a result of the savior, we have rich people, happy people, safe people. So, if it sounds a little religious, it's because this imagery and this motif is very powerful. And we perhaps don't always realize when it washes over us quite how influential it can be. So that's the thinking, that's the background, that's where all this stuff comes from, in my view. So what's happened subsequently? Well, for the past 20 years almost now, there's been an absolute explosion of work in the private sector and in the academic sector, trying to put some flesh on the bones of that sort of proposition, that smart cities proposition. And there's many different elements of work, many different directions I could highlight. I've picked out 4 particular elements, and I'm going to mention 1 or 2 of the bits of work that we've been doing recently that touch on these in a moment. But the 4 particular elements are, firstly, the growth in capability in sensing. And this is both a hardware and a software issue, and there's a lot of development taken place in that area. The second, very much consequent upon the first, is that what those sensing systems in the various forms that they exist and will exist in the future do is spout data. So we are entering a world in which we have and will have increasingly enormous volumes of data that are spouted out by these sensing systems which we are deploying in order to achieve integration, Related to these new data sources are a whole set of work related to new ways of exploiting the data, new sorts of diagnostic and predictive analytics around both the behavior of systems, inanimate things, and the behavior of the people who interact and, in some senses, comprise the systems. So these analytics are being applied both to inanimate and animate behavior. And then sitting on top of all of that, though at the bottom of my particular list, you have decision support tools of various sorts. Tools that seek to give individuals or system managers in one form or another a basis for making better and increasingly better real-time decisions about how to interact with the rest of the complex world in order to achieve their objectives. And an enormous amount of work has been launched at various levels, at national level, at international level, and within individual institutions, Imperial and King's and many others as well. So a few examples of this. I don't want to bore you too much with techie stuff, but a few examples of the sort of things that have happened. So can you still hear me? Does the mic work? So one of the things that we've done is develop mobile sensor networks. So we can equip people and vehicles and infrastructure that moves around cities to sniff what's happening in cities and assimilate those data into a modeling stack which enables us to make predictions, which then enables us to make or to provide advice that drives control. Another example of pervasive sensing is booking and reservation systems for curb space. Curb space is an extremely valuable commodity in city centres because people want to deliver and collect things. Yet it's managed currently in a very haphazard way. You could manage it much more efficiently if you can monitor the curb activity and create a market around the bidding and sale of those curb booking slots. And that's what we did in that particular project. A lot of stuff has been done around predictive analytics. And the predictive analytics are getting smarter and smarter. And also, by the way, less and less intelligible. And that's rather disturbing, and we might come back to that in discussion. I won't go into the details of that. But these predictive analytics then enable system managers, in this case transport system managers, to understand the situation that they have in front of them and how it might evolve in the future and make better decisions in the style of model predictive control. Cross-sectoral integration. Remember that the salvation was integration, and probably the sector that this, or the two sectors where this has been most directly expressed, and perhaps even most successfully expressed, is in the interface between energy and transport. You will all be aware of the ambitions of central government to decarbonize the transport system and the commitment that it has made, the ultimate of stretch targets, to have a largely electric surface transport system by 2040. Well, if this is going to happen, those two systems, the transport system and the energy system, have to interact in very deep ways. So two examples of that. Over here, the idea is, can a commercial operator, like a bus company, run electric buses in such a way that it not only collects revenue from passengers, but it also can provide services to the grid. The power grid is undergoing, that's the thing that provides our electricity, is undergoing radical change at the moment for a whole variety of reasons, principally related to the transition to renewables. Renewables are characterized by many things, but intermittency is one of them. So we have a much less stable power grid, so there's a need for new services that will help stabilize the grid. Can the big batteries that will sit in these battery-powered buses be used to provide those grid balancing services? And can the bus operators make money out of that? So that's what this thing, and the answer is yes, by the way. Another one related to the interface between transport and the power grid is around dynamic pricing. Because of this instability that I mentioned, the grid will be more vulnerable in future to spikes in demand that might be brought about by electric mobility operation. So those spikes have to be disincentivized by price signals. So this particular project says. And so this is about creating the right sort of price signals to maintain stability of the grid, but enable the transport function to be delivered to its users. So I could go on talking about the wonderful things that we do, but I don't want to do that. I want to draw us back to the bigger picture. Remember that the motif here is your salvation is in integration. But that isn't actually what's happening. That's the really interesting thing about innovation in cities at the moment. That although this dynamic was launched with that particular proposition, salvation and integration, what people are finding increasingly is that integration between these big, important subsystems, well-established, historically deep component subsystems, is very difficult. And it's essentially stalled, in my view. And there's many, many reasons. I've highlighted a few here, but there are others we can talk about if people want. The first is, as with all innovation, the innovators hype it to hell. And there then is a reaction to the hype. We all know this, right? And this stuff has been hyped to hell, and there's been a reaction. And the reaction has pointed quite legitimately to the fact that there's very little practical demonstration of the benefits of this salvation by integration proposition. Very, very few practical demonstrations. Some of the barriers that the salvation by integration motif was meant to overcome around the silos associated with different components of data have not been overcome. In fact, they've become worse. The original idea was that when people realized that all the benefits that could be accrued to society as a whole by these new data sources and all the clever analytics that would sit on top of these new data sources, people would just offer up their data for the common good. It's not quite working like that, predictably enough. You know, if somebody bangs on to you about how much your data is worth, are you going to open it to everybody? Of course you're not. So actually, the motif has reinforced some of those data silos, not reduced them. Critically, that is because no one has yet come up with a sustainable and credible and scalable business model for how a smart city should work. And how the various actors who would need to be engaged can transition from their existing business models, how a transport operator or a power utility or a water company can transition from the way they make their money now inside the regulatory structures that define their modus operandi, how they can transition from that to a new business model where they're all happily working together. No one's done that work. And until someone does that work, it won't happen. And even if somebody does do that work, insofar as the public sector is involved in a lot of this stuff, has its finger in the pie in various ways, the monumental dysfunctionality of public sector procurement, which I'm sure many people in the room are only too familiar with, will stymie it anyway. So what has happened? Well, what has happened is that at the same time as this dinosaur has been staggering and not really making much progress, all the little mammals have come out. And these little mammals aren't selling grandiose solutions. They're not promising to save the planet. No. They're promising to make useful contributions to pain points felt by consumers. So I've put down a few here. I could put down many others. Personalized information systems. Many of you are sitting there with your mobile phones and they'll carry an app called City Mapper. It's in many respects one of the great achievements of the smart city movement is that it has come out with its functionality. There are peer-to-peer services, Uber, Airbnb, many others. Rent My Drill is my favorite. But say it without commenting. So these platform technologies. And finally, there are slightly more sophisticated, but still essentially consumer propositions, the aggregators and arbitrage services, for example, in the power industry, very, very successful company called Kiwi Power. Now, what is it that enables these to flourish and those not? Well, I think it's a few things. Firstly, as I said earlier, these things aren't trying to boil the ocean, not trying to save the world. They're not trying to make everything better for everybody, la, 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 la. They're addressing localized, specific problems, pain points. And the technical challenges associated with addressing those pain points, although not by any means trivial, are much, much less in scale and scope than the technological challenges associated with achieving the salvation by integration objective. Secondly, and this is extremely important, by and large, these services are business to consumer, not business to government or business to business. And if there's one thing that history teaches, as the man said, it's that individual consumers make better customers than governments or mayors or other big corporates. And finally, I think there's frankly a lack of ego, a preparedness to adapt, a preparedness to modify. All of these services in various forms have been through multiple rebirths and reconfigurations and so on. That's much more difficult to achieve when you think you are the redemptive force, because you think you've got it right, and other people should just understand how right you are. So what does that mean in summary? Well, I think it means that smart cities and the problems that motivated the creation of this particular dynamic, they're here to stay, they won't go away. Those problems are real. They may be sources of panic and they may be exaggerated, amplified and manipulated, but that isn't to say that they're not real. The smart cities 1.0, if I can call it that, the first generation idea which I'm discussing here, in many ways from where I stand now, looks a bit vulgar and simplistic. And I think it just hasn't worked. And it's been outmaneuvered by other propositions that have been more agile and more in tune with customer and market requirements. But it doesn't mean that those fundamental problems go away. It doesn't mean that those fundamental drivers have been solved. So I think the challenge for innovators is to recast this idea in a way that is capable of addressing some of those challenges. And that, as a task, I leave to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John. Now I know that John can't be with us this afternoon for the panel discussion, unfortunately. So we do have time, we're making time for a couple of questions. And we'll see what we can squeeze in first. So you're kind of going down on centralisation and saying it's the little innovators, but wasn't that enabled by changes in government policy, because CityMapper would never have been possible without a decision to open the APIs on the transport system, and in fact, in general, the government transparency agenda of releasing information or releasing APIs that then enable people to provide better interfaces?
Yes, two comments. The first is that only a tiny part of the data held by Transport for London, or more generally the transport system, is available through
real-time data.
Only a tiny part, including a tiny part of the real-time data, are available in that way. And secondly, the second part is that some of the pressures that I mentioned earlier around the realization of the potential value in data is putting pressure on this openness at the moment. So it'll be very interesting to see how that develops in future. Will the data that are open now remain open in future? We shall see.
Hi, you gave a relatively world-weary, over here. You gave a relatively world-weary summary of the subject.
It comes with the age, you know?
Yes, but for those of us who are outside it, is there a practical way forward? For example, are there test cases outside of the UK and other places where perhaps governments like China can essentially pull this together in one place, say this is how you would do this? Or do you think we need to radically rethink how we approach the whole notion of smart city?
I'm more in the latter than the former. There are certainly societies and cultures that are better at doing centralization than we are. And China springs to mind, obviously. Whether that is a sufficient condition to realize the original objective of smart cities is quite another thing. You know, one of the many things that was overlooked in the original proposition is, and that is blindingly obvious to anyone from a systems background, is that the more you join things together, the more vulnerabilities you create. And the more complex the systems you create, the more vulnerable they become. When you mix that almost topological reality with the corresponding reality that increasingly the analytical tools that are being deployed and will be deployed in future are tools that are not like the simple inference mechanisms that we've seen in the past, where you write down an equation or a system of equations and you can understand what they do, and you have a theory that dictates the behavior of these systems. Increasingly, these systems are going to be driven by, I hate the word artificial intelligence, it's so stupid, but if I use it, you'll know what I mean. AI stuff that is essentially unfathomable to a human. Now, when you put together this topological complexity with control that no one understands, I think whoever tries to do that at a city scale risks serious catastrophe.
I'm going to take just one last question and then we'll stop. So it's very quick. So in the taxonomic criteria, is Google a dinosaur or a mammal?
Oh, it's definitely a dinosaur, but it would like you to believe that it has mammalian characteristics. I think that's as much as I can say without being banned by YouTube.
I'm going to leave it there. John, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.